The young man was seated in someone's arms, looking tired and hearing someone pray to God. It was probably the person whose arms surrounded the young man. His gaze was fixed on the door, which someone was knocking on forcefully, as if about to burst open. In the tired eyes of the boy, a cross was already visible, but he continued to hear prayers of blessing. The noises from the door being struck were getting louder and louder. He was still sitting in the arms of the person under the table, tightly pressed against each other as if protecting themselves from all the horrors of the world. The boy and the woman were sitting there. Perhaps it was during this dark period that the boy first realized something, and what he realized, we will discover a little later. The door collapsed with a crash. The woman started calling the boy desperately, and in turn, the boy called his mother. It was as if they were saying goodbye, and tears welled up in the boy's eyes as he tried with all his might not to let go of his mother's hand. As she left, the woman asked the boy to remember that she would always love him. As she emerged from under the table, leaving her son there, considering it the safest place, she almost forcibly removed her hand from his grasp. The boy cried and screamed in fear. Now, let's go back to what the boy felt for the first time during this dark period. He felt that a sad hunger awaited all his loved ones. Under his feet was a framed photo of him, his father, and his mother. Cries were heard, and the boy, looking at all this with tear-filled eyes, could not believe what was happening. The boy's mother was asking for something. Not only asking but begging, but she was not allowed to finish. She fell silent. The boy sitting under the table had already plugged his ears and closed his eyes. His mother's bloodied hand appeared before him. It's not difficult to guess what happened, but even if he knew his curse, his eager heart still craved warmth. Everything described was to him like a dream, or rather like memories appearing in his dream. So, when our hero opened his eyes, he felt a gentle touch on his cheek. The owner of this hand kindly asked him if he had another nightmare. Above our hero was a brunette with straight hair. She had pleasant features and a very caring look. She assured our hero that nothing terrible would happen because she was there for him. After a while, we can see the same girl standing on the edge of a structure above the sea during the dark hours. A pair of shoes was already floating in the water. Our hero hoped that happiness would last forever. But as if to mock this false idea, on the edge of that structure, a man in a burgundy suit was holding this girl in his arms. The girl asked for help from our hero, but he could do nothing because two ruffians held him back. In his gaze, the same horror could be observed as when they killed his mother. He shouted the girl's name and begged them to stop, but no one listened. The girl, she was panicked. Tears flowed from her eyes. She cried that she didn't want to die like this, with a gun pointed at her temple and delicate hands twisted behind her back. Just moments after these words, a bullet entered the girl's head, blood splattered in all directions, and the young woman fell backward. Her assassin smirked maliciously with satisfaction. Hale watched this with horror and realized that his hope had been shattered into pieces, reminding him once again of the cursed fate. He saw the killer toss the girl into the sea, the lifeless body in a white nightshirt. Her dress and hair floated in the wind while the man in the red suit observed the scene. The beaten young man was still in the hands of the two ruffians standing beside him. He desperately kept the man in red and could barely understand what was being said to him. Namely, that all of this happened because our hero had crossed the line, standing like a sovereign above our hero. The thug in the red suit pressed his weapon to the boy's forehead and whispered that loneliness suited him better. Moments later, numerous gunshots rang out among the houses, or rather, by the sea. Some time later, our hero walked along a concrete wall, where his name was visible in his mouth. The young man held a cigarette, and there was a blood stain on the wall. He understood that from now on, he would never let anyone get close to him. He left the alley where countless bloodied corpses lay, clearly killed by our hero. Hale seemed to have vowed to dedicate his entire existence solely to vengeance. Arriving at a specific location, the young man began to reload his gun, his clothes and hands stained with something ranging from tobacco, closing his eyes with pleasure. The young man thought that, as he had imagined, he was finally ready to meet his creator. But then, a red-haired girl started shouting at him not to go. In front of him stood a red-haired girl with green eyes, holding his hand with the gun, yelling that he couldn't die. She looked very worried and clearly did not want our hero to be harmed in any way, and he kept her with confusion. The young girl was almost crying, ordering him not to die. Her big green eyes were fixed on him, and she repeated incessantly that Hale had to live. He looked at her with perplexity and apprehension. He still had a lit cigarette in his mouth, and his face was stained with blood. Our hero tried to understand how he could mistake this girl for the red-haired one. They both froze. She stood there, holding his hand and looking him straight in the eyes while he leaned slightly, trying to find answers to these questions in her eyes. You couldn't look away from his gaze, and what happened next, we will know very soon. The girl lay on the ground among scattered objects, looking very content, and our hero, as if to protect her from any danger, leaned over the young woman. In one hand, he held a gun, and in the other, a cigarette lit on a beautiful sunny day in one of the city's missions. A cheerful greeting was heard. A red-haired girl with big green eyes entered the room. In one hand, she held a small basket, and in the other, she supported a bag hanging on her shoulder. She joyfully shouted to the people present that she was back. One of the young men in the room even jumped for joy, and looking at this heroine, exclaimed in surprise, then repeated that she was back. Meanwhile, another man sitting nearby, absorbed in the computer screen, paid no attention to the red-haired girl and simply congratulated her on her return. Blushing, the girl asked those present to guess what the client had given her. The guy nearby watched all this amusingly, just like the red-haired girl, while some others still paid no attention to it. Then, a moment later, the girl began to show the basket containing fortune cookies. Her happiness was limitless, as if she were a child seeing this wonder for the first time. The girl repeated enthusiastically that they were free, offered to the clients as part of a promotional campaign, and suggested that everyone present take some by passing the basket. The young man holding the basket admired her, and in an instant, his eyes widened, and he began to think about something, looking somewhere in the distance. Looking at the empty space among his colleagues, she asked those present where Ha was. Some didn't even notice him. Everyone was absorbed in the fortune cookies. But one of the employees wearing glasses, while trying to open a fortune cookie, lazily looked at the girl and told her that our hero had just gone out to smoke a cigarette. After a moment of reflection, he added that he had gone out to smoke 2 hours ago, just a second ago. The lovely redhead transformed into an angry girl, and the biscuits in her hand crumbled with a crack as she squeezed them with her hands, unnoticed by the dentist. Indignation knew no bounds. She was trying to understand how he could have gone out to smoke for a full 2 hours. Meanwhile, her fortune, thanks to the cookies that said, "You will discover a new facet of someone familiar, be careful," fell to the ground. This prediction hit the nail on the head. Our hero approached the spot where a sign indicating closed was visible. He stood there, calmly puffing on his cigarette as if contemplating his course of action. After a brief reflection, he flicked the cigarette away. Exhaling the last smoke, he confidently headed towards the building where laughter could be heard. Approaching the window, he overheard a call for someone to do whatever was necessary. In the middle of the room, a young man knelt before the laughing guys, trying to understand if all this was real. Then they started calling him a bong guy and assured him that they knew he wanted to live in that room. The man in the red suit, who had killed our hero's beloved, sat on the sofa, sipping something while gleefully watching the scene unfold. The kneeling guy had his eyes blindfolded, and they began to say that they urgently needed a liver and Rh-negative heart. Tears streamed down the guy's cheeks, and he pleaded for mercy. One of the captors, mocking the blindfolded guy, started talking while pointing to one of the targets. If he hit it, they would let him go, he swore, and even offered him an extension to repay his debt. All this, of course, if he hit the center of the target. I remind you he was blindfolded. Then the gleeful bandit handed a dart to the young man, who, while praying for anyone willing to listen, with trembling hands and sobs, lifted the dart and tried to aim. But how could he aim when he couldn't see? The villains yelled at him to give it his all. A second later, something flew towards the target. It wasn't a dart, it was a knife that struck the dartboard. Everyone present was perplexed, and the blindfolded boy even staggered backward. The man in the brown suit tried to figure out what was happening. They all collectively looked at the door where a man stood. The door creaked open, and with a laugh, our hero entered the room, closing the door behind him. He asked everyone present why the hell they were all gathered here in broad daylight. Throughout this time, he kept his hand on the door handle, then, locking the door, he declared with weariness that all these absurdities were damn tiring. Crossing the room, he lowered his head, hearing everything they were saying to him. He repeated his initial question, trying to understand what he was doing. One of the thugs couldn't hold back and shouted after him, asking who he was. The guy probably wanted to say something but didn't get the chance. When our hero sliced the throat of this opponent, Hale tried to understand why these people couldn't just sit in their office like normal people. Watching all this, the other villains were terrified and tried to understand what had just happened. As he threw the corpse of the dead man with the slashed throat, he shot a furious glance at the others and continued the sentence he had started. The essence was that if they had stayed in the office, he wouldn't have had to look for them. One of the adversaries pointed a gun at our hero, who used the corpse as a shield and ordered them to kill him. But the young man was much faster, and in a few seconds, he lunged with a knife at the thugs approaching him. He threw the corpse, which fell on the guy with the gun, while another thug received a knife in the forehead. No one expected such a turn of events. Hale picked up a long structure and flew towards the adversaries with it. He knocked the weapons out of the thugs' hands, taking everyone by surprise, giving our hero an advantage. Our hero began to scatter his foes left and right without even blinking. This movement was so precise that one might think he had trained for it or had a specific plan in mind. All that could be seen was blood splattering in different directions. Meanwhile, the blindfolded guy did not remove his blindfold but sat at the table, trying to cover his ears to avoid hearing all this horror. After a while, our hero's shadow fell near the corpses. Without much thought, the young man grabbed the man in the red suit by his tie and began dragging him somewhere. While the man was cursing, our hero dragged him onto the stage. But why? The man in red ordered him to let him go, trying to defend himself with threats and statements that he was an important person. He tried to find out if our hero knew who he was, but the young man didn't listen. The man took the microphone, wrapped the microphone cord around the man's neck as he tried to say something but was sorely lacking air. After strangling him, our hero tossed the microphone away, lifting the man in the red suit above the stage with all his strength. The man tried to free himself because he was seconds away from death. Our hero ordered him to answer all his questions, and only then would he release him. Nearby, he held the microphone and continued talking about the drug smuggling they were dealing with. Then he lit a dictaphone. Meanwhile, the man was still trying to free himself. Our hero felt pity for the people involved in the smuggling that he kept in an underground safe. He asked for the safe code. All this time, he looked at the man attentively, encouraging him politely to hurry before he choked. The breathless man began to stammer and repeat the numbers one after the other. Our hero recorded all the words spoken on the dictaphone. During this time, all his actions seemed to evoke no emotion in him. It was as if he had no heart at all. After hearing everything, he dropped the microphone, and the man in the red suit fell on the stage with a crash. While the man in the red suit tried to free himself from the rope and massage his strangled neck, Hale thanked him nonchalantly. Then, in a second, he turned his head and saw the barrel of a gun in front of him. All that remained for him was to smile. Click, and his head exploded into small pieces. After the act, our hero took out a cigarette from a pack. The room was littered with corpses, some just lying there, while others were our hero was about to light up when he heard unfamiliar apologies coming from an unknown source. He tried to understand what it was and where it came from. It was the blindfolded guy who had already removed the blindfold, peeking behind the chair, looking directly at our hero, asking if he had come to get him, if they had come back to save him. But paying little attention to the boy, Hale lit his cigarette and said that saving people wasn't his thing. The entire scene looked like some kind of spectacle. The light falling on the stage, our hero sitting and looking into the distance while smoking a cigarette, and the bodies scattered around. It seemed like an interesting idea for a show. The sound of a perfume spray, a range of products from a single brand, a set on the keyboard. Our hero was already sitting at his desk, trying to do something. Suddenly, there was a cry beside him, but he didn't care because he looked too tired and tormented. Standing just above him, the enraged girl, who turned out to be the team leader, addressed him by his name. Marin Lane, she shouted, trying to find out if he knew what time it was and where he had been all morning. Marin Lane shouted and screamed, but the boy didn't even look at her, completely ignoring her. She continued to shout, almost losing her voice. Then she tried to figure out if he was joking, and then she began to wonder how he could be so shameless. Meanwhile, the phone rang. The girl, addressing our hero, said that she had already told him more than once. The phone kept ringing, but no one paid attention. The girl repeated that if he continued to treat work like this, she didn't finish her sentence because she was already boiling with anger. She even closed her eyes and then, taking a deep breath, the girl screamed so loudly that the whole office heard her, begging someone to finally answer the phone. But everyone was too calm and busy with their work. However, the guy with pink hair, distracted from his search, picked up the phone. Then the girl made sure that the work was progressing at full speed regime and tried to remember where she had left off. Our hero teased her by quoting the last sentence of the screen. If you continue to treat the work this way, Marin Lane, as if awakening, stopped shouting. She repeated that this couldn't continue. She tried to understand if he had heard the phone ring just now, but our hero was looking at her so calmly that it irritated her even more. Ignorant of what the young girl was saying, the young man took the phone in his hands and began to examine something. The young woman repeated, with weariness, that they were overwhelmed with work and our hero kept going out to smoke, not returning for hours. On the phone, it was already seen that it was 16:37, and a new message announced the arrival of new smoking product. The young girl, observing the young man's behavior, asked him if he was listening at that moment. Our hero began to stand up. The girl collapsed even more because of Hale's actions. She began desperately asking him where he was going, as he had a lot of work planned for today. The young man seized a blue folder. After that, he declared that he would just go out to smoke a cigarette. Taking the folder without saying anything, he began to put on his jacket, while a colleague nearby admired the young man's behavior. Without much thought, he turned around and started to leave, and all the people present simply watched what was happening. A moment later, one of the colleagues asked the girl, who was flipping through the report our hero had given her before leaving, why she hadn't just fired him. As she left, the girl said that Hale was really good at what he did. But it seems that the guy with pink hair didn't understand the answer. The girl, enthusiastically going through the entire report, began to repeat with enthusiasm that he was a true individualist but did his job too well. The actions then unfolded in one of the streets of the metropolis where everyone is always in a hurry. Our hero, already in need of nicotine, was smoking a cigarette on the street, thinking it was time to go back to work. But what work was it, and what did he plan in general? We will know very, very soon. Now everything will happen during a government meeting. A man stands in front of a screen, and several people listen to him. This man was in uniform and began his dialogue by stating that everyone now lives in the grip of criminal cartels day and night. They trade in human trafficking and organs, and the drugs they put on the market ensure a constant flow of addicts who have no choice but to turn to the criminal world to satisfy their thirst. As a result, they fall into the cauldron that lured them into this trap. In our time, it is impossible to distinguish in any way an innocent citizen from a cartel member. Sooner or later, this city will become nothing more than fertile ground for vice. One cannot rely on a soft and legal approach. And then this man added that they must destroy them all, down to the last one. It's their last chance to clean up this place. One of the men on the screen spoke, stating that they were smart enough to hide their tracks and escape the investigation. They won't be able to find a legal basis for their arrest until they start to act. So authorities cannot resort to brute force first. Looking at the compass, this man continued, asserting that this is particularly true regarding the organization that is at the center of all this. For now, IPA is trying to emerge from the shadows. The man who said all this and walked in the room tried to address the mayor, the governor, and the president. Then he said he would like to propose a solution to all their problems. He suggests creating an unofficial target group, a squad of kamikaze, a team of talented agents who have personally suffered at the hands of the cartels. They thirst for revenge, and above all, they accomplish the mission no matter what. Standing at the end of the negotiation table, this man continued, stating that they must support them by providing information and weapons but also discreetly sponsoring them. Of course, he then proposed to disguise the coordination point as an ordinary establishment. It is at this precise moment that our hero entered the establishment. The cheerful bartender behind the bar greeted him joyfully and suggested he enter quickly. The room was bright and spacious. After Hale sat at the bar counter, the bartender affirmatively said he had come earlier than expected. And it's great, he really wants to give it to you as soon as possible. Remembering the red-haired girl and how she screamed, our hero said he had to leave. The bartender started running around the counter, seeming to search for something, all the while saying that for some reason, the boss had chosen a good brand of cigarettes this time. He knows that our hero constantly complains about being given bad cigarettes. A moment later, the bartender opened a drawer containing all the necessary weapons and a pack of cigarettes. And this bartender is not as simple as he seems at first glance. Taking a cigarette from the pack, the young man began to examine it and realized it was a classic cigarette. The colored filter seemed somewhat unusual. Our hero thought that this cigarette had a strong and slightly suffocating smoke smell, but its delicate charm compensated for this inconvenience. The bartender looked even kinder. Then he continued, saying he thought our hero would like them. After a little thought, he added that this cigarette suited him better than anyone else. Our hero took a cigarette. Something was written on it. The bartender continued, saying that in addition to all this, the boss had also given him the coordinates, but he said he didn't need them because he already knows everything. Approaching the cigarette shelf, the bartender pointed to a specific type and asked how many packs he would take this time. Then he asked if one pack would be enough. Our hero did not respond to that, just looking at him with a nostalgic look. After some thought and looking at the ashtray, he said he would take the whole box. After all, cigarettes are usually provided in boxes, either 10 packs or 20 packs. The bartender murmured that he hadn't changed at all. Our hero recalled how he had handed him a pack of cigarettes and told him he would receive instructions through them. They strongly advised him not to smoke them. Sitting at the table face to face, our hero's interlocutor continued to develop his thought, stating that the smell of cigarettes at the crime scene could become evidence leading to our hero. With his hand largely covered in bandages, our hero began to take the pack and said that all these prohibitions only made him want to smoke his cigarettes even more. Just as he was lighting a cigarette from the pack, Hale interrupted the conversation about it because no one knows when he will make the jump, wiping the plate. The bartender advised our hero to take care of himself in the office. The redhead sat thoughtfully and pondered. She saw that it was already 7:38, so she assumed our hero would not come back. Therefore, she decided that this time she would fire him for good. She did not notice how the colleague standing next to her had tried to call her. She was still thinking about who he thought he was. After all, she could always hire someone else. The requirements are minimal, basic manners. The girl even shed a tear. She had still not heard that they were trying to call her. She wondered what difference it makes if he is handsome and good at what he does. She cannot work with such a person, so why force herself? In a chapter during the girl's reflections, the colleague began to scream her name. This action terrified the girl, and she even screamed, her hair standing on end. The monster-like young man stared at her, then began to speak, saying he didn't want to scare her, he just couldn't reach her. The girl began to apologize, saying she was just lost in her thoughts. Then the frightened girl regained her composure and asked what he was doing here, calling this young man Jaden. Isn't he supposed to be at the meeting with clients discussing the menu and surveillance cameras? Facing each other, the guy said that something had happened, and at that moment, his phone rang. Naturally, this young man answered the phone and said it was Jane Merle. Then he asked who it was, and after a while, this guy began to justify himself. He explained how they realized he had lost the folder containing all the information about their company. Then someone asked him why he was 2 hours late. After all, that seems terrible. Hearing all this, Marion Lane was horrified and wondered how he could lose the folder, and he didn't call anyone to warn that he wouldn't come. At first, Jaden did not understand the essence of the question. Then he innocently said that he simply did not call. Yeah, it happened. He didn't think about it. He was too nervous. Then he asked if the girl was angry. At that moment, all the employees started packing up their workstations, saying it was time to go home and saying goodbye. The guy tried to calm the girl, saying she shouldn't be angry with him, that he would do his best, and he would definitely learn a lesson. The girl was horrified and didn't know what to do. She grabbed her hair and looked at the ceiling. At the same time, she asked how she could kill this employee. It's very funny because at that moment, he asks the same question. Only if the girl's anger passes quickly does our hero take it quite seriously. Looking at the face of a person who clearly understands the consequences, he began to say that he can't even imagine what will happen. Then he called him Peter. Our hero stood on top of this person, and placing the gun against his open mouth, began to speak, saying that he could barely recognize him because he had gained weight. He must be eating well. While our hero was absent, Peter tried to understand where he came from because he had heard that Hale was dead. Taking a cigarette from the pack, our hero confidently told Peter that it was his long-standing weakness, further asserting that Peter easily believes in things he hasn't seen with his own eyes, such as promises of reward. At this point, the gun was already pressed against Peter's temple, and our hero continued to speak, saying that Peter also believed in the glory he would receive by taking our hero's place. As he pressed the trigger of the gun, he said that Peter would surely end up in hell, but Peter tried to stop him, stammering that it wasn't him. Yes, he invited our hero there that day, but looking at Hale's contours, Peter continued to speak, assuring him that he couldn't kill her, calling her Ricky and recalling the contours of the young girl, calling her by her name. It was his fatal mistake. Our hero's eyes became furious. He covered Peter's mouth with one hand and pointed a gun at his face with the other, starting to shoot bullets one after another. There was no trace of life left on his face. It was just a disaster. The guy turned and ordered him not to dare mention the name of that girl. After a while, the door opened and another guy entered, calling Ricky's name again. Our hero clearly did not expect such a turn of events. He looked at the entrance. Our hero's face was entirely covered in blood. The guy started running through the alleys of MGA police, screaming. It seemed like he heard Peter say Ricky. The guy never missed a target. Then turning around, he asked aloud if he had managed to escape, but he did not see that our hero was standing right in front of him, and in an instant, our hero had already lifted the young man above him by the neck. The guy was terrified. This guy was the best killer in the cartel. Hale said with an attitude that he hated playing hide and seek. Marion Lane was tapping something on her phone. She was typing a message to Hale, asking if he would return to the office today because she wanted to ask him if he planned to work late in the evening. Leaving the building, the girl closed the door with one hand and held her phone with the other. At that moment, she wished him a good day, but the girl was tired and really hoped that the day would go well. The girl began to think about something, placed her hand on her head, directed her gaze somewhere, then looked again at the screen of her phone, especially the message she had typed to our hero. She realized that she shouldn't send it, but she had already sent him a message asking where our hero was. She tried to type something else and asked a stranger for help. Closing her eyes, she thought, if only our hero could magically appear right in front of me. As she walked down the aisle, she heard some noise and naturally turned all her attention to that alley. There lay the body of the young man that our hero had lifted before. Now his head was smashed, blood everywhere, and our hero was just sitting on the body. When she realized that someone was watching him, he stood up quickly and pointed his gun. Our hero and the pointed gun were reflected in the redhead girl's pupils. She thought he had really come out of nowhere, as it seemed. He stood on each side of the young man's body, looking at her and pointing his gun. Marion Lane watched the scene in horror, and all she could do was utter his name. What happens next, we will discover in the next chapter. The guy twisted the girl's hands behind her back and pressed her with his hands. The girl tried to call our hero and tell him that he had blood on his face. Hale was driving confidently somewhere with Marion Lane and said it wasn't his S because of those high heels. The girl was not walking fast, but our hero was not rushing either, thinking about how terrible the day had been. They approached the body of the killed young man, which still made sounds, and it was possible that he could still be helped. Watching this scene, the girl assumed that this guy had been seriously injured, so she suggested calling an ambulance. But instead of a phone, as the red-haired girl thought, our hero pulled out a gun and started shooting bullets one after another at this man who was already definitively dead. The girl began to scream, but our hero held her in his arms while shooting. The girl was terrified. She opened her eyes even wider, and many questions crowded her mind. For example, where did he find the gun, or did he simply kill him? Seriously, is this really the Hale she knows? Somehow the girl managed to break free from our hero's grip, and in doing so, she shouted at him to let her go. The girl ran towards a fence and begged Hale not to approach her. Then she began to assure that she hadn't seen anything, but our hero was determined. He started reloading his gun, claiming she had seen everything. The girl tried to appear calm and even smiled, saying she wouldn't tell anyone and promised to forget everything. Our hero was too cruel, so he pointed his gun at her, saying he didn't believe her. The girl thought, this is how I'm going to die on the way back to work after buying a snack from someone she considered a colleague. Is this really the worst day of my life? The girl tried to convince the guy not to kill her, asking him to think about the time they spent together. She even mentioned that she had positive feelings towards him and that they were on good terms. Kneeling in front of our hero, she begged him not to kill her because she didn't want to die like this. Hale looked at all of this with a certain horror and even remembered something. He remembered the phrases uttered by the deceased girl before receiving a bullet in the head. She also pleaded for help at the time. Our hero was already in a state of shock, even despair. He definitely didn't know what to do next. He was about to press the trigger when someone called the girl. It was a colleague with whom she went for a snack. He walked and called her by her name, wondering where she had gone and why her phone wasn't responding. He realized he was already very close to the alley where our hero and the girl were. Hale began to hesitate standing in front of the girl. He finally began to speak, saying he was giving her exactly one chance. The young woman was shocked. She stood up quickly and began to thank him enthusiastically. But our hero remained there and watched as the young man was still in place, and the red-haired girl was already starting to scream that she would go, but she didn't notice how she started running, looking at the spreading blood. The girl asked our hero to finish his business at that moment. The young man heard a dialogue between his colleagues. The guy asked the girl what she was doing in that alley when he was looking for her. The girl responded gratefully and offered him to eat her corn dog. The guy accepted. All this was agonizing for our hero, and he searched for a cigarette in his jacket pocket, then began to look around. Jatin was already standing and nibbling on something. All these people were already in the office, including our hero. Addressing the girl, the young man asked her if she wasn't going to eat something, to which she replied that she didn't feel well and offered to eat everything herself. This news pleased the guy a lot. The girl looked around, not understanding why he was working and, in general, how it was possible after everything that had happened. Our hero was sitting at his workstation, typing something on the keyboard without paying attention to anything else. He was too focused. While the girl was pondering all of this, he turned to the guy who had saved Marion Lane and told him that he had found the missing customer data and had just sent it to him. The girl was worried and thanked him while looking at her monitor and browsing through the files he sent. She realized that he was a very competent and intimidating employee. After that, she complimented him on the good job. Jatin approached our hero's workstation and asked him how he had found the data. He replied that he had backup copies of everything he had downloaded last week. The young man asked more questions about the backups, then stood up from his desk and said he would go smoke. The girl was a bit scared seeing this, but a second later, she enthusiastically stammered, telling him to go ahead and smoke as much as he needed. As he left, he said he would be back very soon. The girl watched him leave and waited for the moment the door would close. A shiver ran down her spine, and she already looked at everything with horror. The girl realized that it was her chance to escape from this place as quickly as possible. She began to gather her things hastily, not noticing how terrible and ridiculous it looked from the outside. Her savior saw this scene, so he asked her if she was going home. The girl was troubled and stated that she had urgent problems to solve, and besides, she had to call all the clients. She didn't even finish her sentence before starting to say something else. The young woman turned to Jatin, who clearly didn't understand what she expected from him. Stuttering, she asked if he could do it, and then she fell silent. It was as if something made her step back, and she thought that she couldn't involve anyone in what had happened. While she was fleeing, she shouted at him to forget everything, and Jatin could also go home. Upon entering her apartment, she locked the door with all possible locks, closed the curtains, and stood near the window, reasoning out loud about the need to lock the door and all the windows. Everything is fine, it's safe here. But the girl was too scared, and it prevented her from letting go of the curtains. Looking at her comfortable apartment, she wondered what was happening. She remembered our hero armed with a gun, and, holding her head, she realized that she couldn't think clearly. After putting on her slippers, the young woman began to speak aloud, saying that it was always difficult to understand our hero, but she never considered him a bad person. Behind her, she heard the phrase that he was really a bad person. It was our hero, and she looked horrified as he stood there in her apartment, face to face, staring intensely into each other's eyes. It looked too dark. What will happen next? We will find out in the next chapter. Leaving the office and standing just in front of the entrance, our hero began to call someone. While waiting for a response, he managed to light a cigarette. When someone finally answered, he asked what to do if a civilian noticed him. The person he called belonged to the municipal police. He was sitting on a chair, flipping through some papers, and upon hearing the question, he wondered how he could make such a mistake. It didn't seem like something he would do. This man thought for a moment and said he feared that the common good required sacrifices. Our hero did not like this answer at all. He even forgot his cigarette after hanging up. He saw the red-haired girl rushing somewhere at a crazy speed. The word eliminated was turning in his head. Meanwhile, the girl was still running without looking back, but our hero called her again and asked if he had to eliminate her, even if it's Marion Lane, and he stood there face to face in the girl's apartment. She looked at him with horror and didn't understand what was happening. While looking into our hero's eyes, she seemed to echo his words, saying that he had promised not to kill her. The guy began to walk towards the young woman and extended his hand to her. With tears in her eyes, the girl started screaming that it was the end for her. However, the guy simply took a keychain from her hair, and the keys jingled. The girl didn't stop screaming. Instead, she began to defend herself with some movements. An instant later, our hero asked her where she got the idea that he had come to kill her. The young girl clearly did not expect such a turn of events and looked at him with less fear, but she continued to scream. Looking at her and holding the keychain in his hand, he asked her if he had ever lied to her. The girl, already relieved, thought he really wouldn't kill her, but was she safe? She simply thanked him after her brief relief. The girl noticed his hand with the keychain and indignantly asked why he needed it. It was the keys to her house. The guy stood calmly and just looked at her. Then he said he would live with her. The girl was horrified and couldn't understand how that was possible. As he left, the guy said he had to keep an eye on her. Then he asked if she had a spare room. The girl was too indignant. Perhaps that's why she couldn't say anything to him. While our hero opened the front door, Marion Lane asked him what he was talking about and how all this had happened. Then she said she wouldn't allow anything like that, and it was her house. As he left, our hero stated that there was nothing to worry about. If she chose death, he wouldn't dissuade her. Getting no response, he said that since they had reached an agreement, he would go smoke. The terrified girl watched Hale leave, unable to respond to such a statement. Falling to her knees in helplessness, she wondered if he had spared her or condemned her to death. She kept crying and reasoning in the guest room, but she didn't have a spare room. After a few moments, she thought and was distracted from her tears. She headed to a place where there was clearly a mess. It was a storage room. It was too cluttered and couldn't be considered a free room. The girl looked too desperate, not knowing what to do next. On the way to the metropolis, the traffic light was red, indicating that the traffic was temporarily stopped. Cars stood still, waiting for the green light. Music played in one of the cars. A man was sitting in the back seat, tapping his foot and narrating how drastically his life had changed. He looked very tired. His hat was deeply pulled down into his pockets. He recounted how he tore everything apart and did any task. Even the driver saw all the actions of this person in the rearview mirror. He shook his head in disapproval and continued to narrate that he received nothing in return. Then the gas began to protest. Where the hell is Peter, damn it? He frowned in dissatisfaction. The driver said he understood him very well. This seemed to amuse the guy, and he asked if the driver was joking. Then he continued talking. What can he know? He just turns the steering wheel. In the meantime, someone hit the driver in the front seat. At that moment, something was happening in the front seats, and the guy sitting at the back, unaware, told the driver not to pretend not to understand what was being said and ordered him to drive. But he didn't notice that our hero had already approached the open window. This guy grabbed him by the throat, seizing his face and making him drool. Now the driver couldn't see what was happening behind, so he began to say that maybe he was just a driver, but that he had spent the last decades working for Hept, so he understands what he lacks. Then he said that Hept was much better before. The man sitting in the back didn't understand and even asked again. The driver turned, looking too frightened. His eyes began to tremble, and he tried to ask something, looking straight at our hero who was smoking a cigarette. He called him Ricky, as several people had done before. Hale confirmed it. He remembered that when the bartender handed cigarettes to our hero, he would take one and ask him to look at it. After Peter Cruz's name, there was a plus alpha. The bartender advised him to make more effort. After that, an unexpected bonus awaited him, and now sitting in the back seat, he thought it was indeed a bonus. While smoking a cigarette, he mentioned the name of his deceased girlfriend. Then, turning to the driver, he said that she had always been very kind to him, hadn't she? Recalling the moment when she asked Hale to greet her, he approached the driver and told him that he was Mr. Johnson, the best driver in the world. The driver stood there, looking embarrassed and scratching his head. The girl looked very happy after this memory. Our hero turned to the driver again and asked why he had betrayed him. The driver began to stutter but found no answer to such a question. Pointing his gun over his shoulder, our hero ordered him to drive, and they talked on the way. The driver was visibly unhappy. He was scared. Later, our hero added that he had to be careful. Hale looked too angry. The driver was panicked. The guy called him the driver of the year. Meanwhile, the red-haired girl, with a sense of satisfaction, said finished. In the old storage room, there was a real room, just as it should be, a bed, a bedside table, and very bright. The girl sat in the middle of the bed. She understood that now the place was clean enough for our hero not to kill her. Then she imagined that he would reproach her for assigning him the storage room, and she would leave. Looking out the window, the smile on the girl's face faded slightly. It was already deep night outside, the moon with white dots scattered in the dark sky. She wondered when he would come back, and if he would come back today. At the same time, our hero was driving the car, looking at the sky while smoking a cigarette. He was driving to an unknown place, but exactly where they were going, we will find out in the next chapter. These two arrived in a forest. Our hero pushed the driver in front of him, who begged him to listen, placing his hands on his temples. The man began to say that he had no choice. He had to take care of his family. No one would take care of them if he died. He then stated that they had threatened his family, and at that moment, our hero threw the driver to the ground in front of him. Hale didn't seem interested in this chatter. After all, he was exceptionally good at his job. The man fell with a crash. The young man asked about his deceased girlfriend. He then claimed that the driver knew he would kill her if he took him there. Looking at the driver, our hero continued trying to understand why he couldn't know. According to his words, the driver had been working for Hebt for 10 years. The man tried to justify himself, saying that the girl was alone, while he had 5 in his family, including himself. Was he supposed to sacrifice 5 lives for one? He begged, saying that our hero was still young and could always find someone else. While our hero loaded his gun, he lost patience. He tried to understand what the driver finally meant. Standing above him, he guessed that the man was saying he was innocent. Looking at him, the man tried to defend himself, but it didn't work. He mentioned a new female leader and claimed it was her order. Our hero had no idea about the new boss, so he started asking questions about her. The driver said he had never seen her personally, but then he really got stuck. He even said that anyone, even our hero, would have done the same. At that moment, a gunshot rang out, and the bullet hit the man's hand, and he had heard enough. Meanwhile, the man screamed in pain, approaching the crouched body of the driver. Our hero asked him if he wanted him to go to someone else. No, it was the funniest thing he had heard all year. The driver begged for mercy. Our hero replied that he appreciated Johnson's care. He then said, as a sign of gratitude, he could give him a chance to survive. In an instant, he drew a line on the ground with his boot and said the driver should not cross that line. So, if his actions were truly justified, he was sure that God would not turn away from him. These words and the actions of our hero shocked the driver. Screaming in pain, he tried to get up. And as he fled from our hero, he tried to shout that he had made the right choice, that he was not guilty. At that moment, the gun was pointed directly at the man's back. All of this amused the young man. His gun was already aimed at the target, and in an instant, gunshots echoed in the silence of the night. Approaching one of the doors, our hero tried to break in. Behind the door emerged the bartender who had given our hero the cigarettes with bumps. He looked too sleepy and didn't understand what was happening. Seeing our hero, he uttered his name and asked what he was doing there. Ignoring these questions, our hero asked his own and specifically inquired if there was something he didn't know. This question plunged the bartender into some kind of shock. He then asked what was happening. Hale heard that Hebt had a new leader, a female leader. Such words were certainly not expected by the man in the middle of the night, and I doubt he had ever been ready to hear them from our hero. Approaching the bar counter, our hero began to say that, according to the instructions, he must entrust him with a special mission if he asks. The young man sitting behind the bar counter said he didn't understand anything. Then, looking into the distance with nonchalance, he began to say that Hebt was strictly a family business. The leadership positions were distributed among family members by blood, and he was absolutely sure that all the women among them had died in the last power struggle. The bartender, who was in charge of the cabinets, agreed with him. Then he said he had also learned it not long ago, and he was just as confused as our hero. In general, the management stated that it needed to deepen its knowledge. Taking out a pack of cigarettes, the man said the investigation would take time as it was new for everyone. Meanwhile, he had a job for him, but there was a problem. After that, the bartender seemed hesitant, looking at our hero. He finally gathered his courage and said he should save someone. But our hero immediately refused. The bartender clearly expected that and declared that, In this case, he was obliged to inform him that he would not get any new information. Extinguishing the cigarette in the ashtray, our hero sighed because, once again, he was given a job that didn't match his profile. After all, he only kills people, he has saved no soul. He asked the bartender to tell him that he would prefer to double the number of murders. At that moment, his phone rang. It was his alarm. Almost immediately, he turned it off. The bartender asked where he was going. After all, our hero calmly replied that he was in a hurry to work. One of his colleagues asked if he was going like that in his state. In response, our hero echoed the last word, and indeed, his clothes were stained with the blood of the driver he had killed. Entering the workplace, he declared that he was stuck in traffic. At that moment, Marion Lane was already sitting at her desk and was slightly shocked to see our hero. The killer had appeared, who had disappeared somewhere after making him clean his room all night, finally came to work. The young girl was furious, but as she looked at our hero, she was already slightly shocked, just like Jane standing beside her. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, and all the colleagues who were already at work were also perplexed. Our hero was dressed too elegantly. His suit and cape were in light tones, just like his shirt. Each shade suited him well and highlighted everything that could be highlighted. His hair and bright eyes harmoniously complemented the light professional outfit. Occasionally, the young girl would come out of her office and look at our hero. The idea of wearing this costume came from the bartender. Someone called the guy, and he looked tired. His colleagues came to ask for his help. A man in a green suit and glasses handed him a piece of paper, saying that it had to be done by the end of the day. A red-haired girl also handed him a yellow folder, asking him to do it since he was there. Our hero didn't respond, and Marin Lane thought that maybe all the guys had gone crazy again. You can't leave all your work to Hale like that. At one point, the young girl was horrified, thinking, what if he gets angry and starts killing everyone here? Well, she went to the extreme, of course, but still, this thought gave her chills. The young man got to work, holding a cup of coffee in one hand. At some point, another colleague approached him and asked if he could make a copy since he was already up. He handed him a piece of paper and smiled kindly. Our hero didn't say anything in response. He just looked at his colleague with confusion. His eyes started to tremble, and the young girl was horrified because she expected something terrible. At one point, she flew towards our hero, throwing herself at him. She tore the paper that their colleague had just given him, telling him she'd better make a copy. In doing so, she didn't notice how the cup of coffee spilled on our hero's light shirt, and now the coffee splattered on his shirt. The young man grabbed the girl's wrist to prevent her from falling, but she asked him if he was okay, and they stood there, holding each other, looking into each other's eyes. What will happen next, we will find out soon. A few hours earlier, our hero was absorbed in something. At that moment, a red-haired girl was watching him. A man in a green suit entered the room, and turning to our hero, asked him to order coffee because they had run out. Our hero immediately agreed, but upon hearing this, Marin Lane raised her hand and said enthusiastically that she would do it herself. Our hero was perplexed, observing this scene. Some time later, during work, someone asked the guy to answer the phone. Again, our hero agreed, but before he could answer, the young girl responded and started talking to the client in one of the rooms. As she was looking for something, suddenly Marin appeared. She immediately asked Hale what he was looking for. The guy replied that he was looking for information on the additional phone installation at the hospital. The young girl scratched her head and said that all that information was with her. Watching this scene, their colleagues didn't understand what was happening to their boss today. After Marin declared that all the necessary information for our hero was with her, she joyfully said that she would take care of it and asked him not to worry. Our hero was clearly not satisfied with such overprotection. At that moment, our hero, still holding the young girl by the wrist, addressing her as Miss Lane, he told her that it was her job. So, he took the paper from the hands of the young girl, who was visibly shocked by this behavior. Glancing at her, the young girl accepted and stepped back as she moved away. She thought she was just trying to help, but he seemed to get angry for some reason. The young man was already going somewhere, probably to deal with his professional issues. Approaching Jaden, he handed him the paper. Jaden was definitely shocked. Our hero did what this young man had asked him to do. Once the paper was in his hands, he thanked Hale. The red-haired girl sitting nearby asked our hero why he hadn't let Marin Lane do the job he was about to do. After all, she offered. But our hero couldn't find an answer to this question. However, after a while, he asked if it's so pleasant to delegate one's work to others and have fun. She clearly didn't expect that and got a bit upset. Well, it's not surprising. She couldn't spread angry rumors. She began lecturing our hero, accusing him of speaking as if he did all the work himself, when in reality, he was no better than her. Hale paid no attention to her, and as he started to leave, the young girl shouted that he was too insolent. Meanwhile, Marin Lane was sitting at her desk trying to do something. But everything was just in darkness. Entering her apartment, the young girl changed her shoes, threw her bag on the floor, turned on the light, and sighed. The girl went to another room, muttering about how tired she was while trying to find the switch. Turning on the light, she saw a young man sitting with his head down on her couch. He asked her to behave as usual, even saying please. The young man was evidently as tired as she was. Hale asked him to act naturally. The girl standing nearby was in some horror and began saying something incomprehensible. After regaining composure, she said she was doing her best because saying it was easier than doing it. Then she hoped for the young man's understanding. Our hero looked closely at the red-haired girl, and she looked at him with her big green eyes. Our hero slowly got up from the couch and began recounting how in the past weeks, the week before last, and even long before starting to work at Maryland Networks, he had spent a lot of time killing people for countless reasons. The girl standing nearby was shocked, wondering if she should congratulate him on that, but all she could say was that she understood. Then the guy started telling how he had saved her life. Leaning towards the clearly terrified girl, he asked if she assumed why he had saved her life. The young girl didn't know how to respond, so after a short while, she asked again why he had saved her life. Was there a reason? She looked desperate. Then she asked again what the reason was, but our hero just looked at her and said nothing. He was about to say something, but something stopped him. He turned around and said he was going to bed, leaving the young girl with a head full of questions. The girl didn't understand what it was. Wasn't he going to finish his speech? All she could do was watch the guy leave. She shouted at him, but he had already closed the door. He stood in a room entirely. Rowan was shocked, remembering what had happened in that room not so long ago. He concluded that the young girl had cleaned it. Then he noticed a teddy bear standing next to the bed. He took it in his hand, passing it from one hand to the other, and began examining the teddy bear. The guy recalled his conversation when Marin Lane's fate was decided. He was told to get rid of her. The man hesitated, so he said that killing her now would be too pointless. He asked to find another way for our hero, placing the teddy bear back where he found it. The guy came to the conclusion that everything was still messy in his room. The young girl was trying to understand why she was alive. She sat and rubbed her cheeks, trying to figure out what it could be. Sitting on her bed, taking off her slippers, she came to the conclusion that it no longer mattered. He let her live, and that's enough. She took her laptop in her hands, and bam, she had another life or death question. The young girl began to open her laptop, remembering the incident. Her colleagues waited for 2 hours at the meeting. She needed to find other clients and quickly. The young girl was determined. She decided she would acquire a new client no matter what, even if she had to knock on every door in the city. Her eyes burned with determination. She knew that if someone responded to 16 emails, she would go through all the circles of hell to get the final agreement. She would even swim in a marathon with alligators if necessary.